Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. Welcome back to our next episode, Talk Data to Me, or Data. It depends on who you ask. Guess so. What region you're in. Hey, before we start, if you've been enjoying listening to the podcast, like always, we would really appreciate if you give us a 5-star review. That just goes a long way in being able to help other people find us and join in the conversation, and hopefully keeps the conversation going with whoever you happen to share us with and things like that. So we would love that. We appreciate it, and we always love hearing from you. So thank you for that. So talk data to me. And or data. That's going to be a thing the whole time. We actually have Brianna and Allie. They've been on the podcast before, but Katie, I'll kind of let you quickly introduce them.
Yeah, so Allie, Masters, and Brianna Sarr-Kerman have been with us before, dear friends of ours, and what I think we would count as experts in their field that are really changing some of the practices in terms of trauma-informed care. So super honored to have worked with both of you and continue to work with you, and then lucky enough to be friends with both of you. So this is really exciting to have you guys back. Brianna is a school psychologist, and Allie is a certified trauma and resiliency coach and special education supervisor. And I don't think I know any two people that know data better than these two, and they love it. So be excited. Hope you hear the passion for the numbers today. So here we go.
Yeah, and data. What are we landing on, guys?
Data. You're in Ohio.
I use them interchangeably.
Yeah.
I do as well.
So,
okay.
Yes. And you're probably going to hear them both ways.
It is okay. Same data or data is safe with us.
Data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. So data. That's what I'm going to go with right now. Is not always necessarily the most exciting thing, but I actually think it's a super important thing, right? Like that's one of the problems that we run into, though, is that it's not super exciting. It's not. You don't feel. I mean, we're going to make it exciting today.
No one loves collecting it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like an extra thing that we have to do. It seems there's all the things that we know about it. So I think as we jump into that, I think we just know that, and we know that there's. That it's sometimes looked at as like an extra, like we have to do this kind of thing. But there's actually a lot of usefulness to it. Hopefully, as we go through the conversation today, we're able to hear what that looks like and why it's important to keep it. So let's jump in. Let's start off. How does data tell the story of our students that we work with?
Well, I think when you're talking about data, I know it may not be the most exciting thing ever for people to collect, but I think it's really important because the data is what helps us with the problem solving. So I think one of the things that teams really should focus on doing before you even talk about procedures, policies, forms, et cetera, is to focus on what types of data you need to collect and to think about it in terms of this is going to help us understand the child better, and it's going to help us solve some problems. Not looking at it as this is a checkbox we have to do so that then we can get this FBA done, then we can get this BIP done, or then we can get a kid evaluated for special education services, or then we can get a change of placement. Instead of looking at like an outcome, looking at it as a process that's going to help you understand the child better. And I think that mindset is really important going into it, because the way that you collect data, the types of processes and conversations you have using that data is going to be different if you're approaching it from a problem-solving mindset as opposed to a checkbox. So that's just my disclaimer about data.
Yeah.
Data. Anyways.
Yeah, and I would just tag on to that. We often consider data just constant checkboxes and constant record keeping, and it's so much more than that. It really like you said, tells the story of the student if it's done effectively and if you're collecting the right data. I was sitting last night at my son's baseball game, and I was thinking, so welcome to my brain. It's a scary place to be.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about, well, let me back up. It was a Friday night. It's been a really long week at work, right? I'm in the people profession. We all are. And by Friday, I'm just peopled out. Right. Okay. So I go and I sit in the outfield because I'm I'm done. I have no more spoons today. I'm empty. I just need to sit and enjoy this nice weather. Right. So I'm sitting out there and I'm thinking, oh, I have that podcast tomorrow. I'm so excited about that. And then I started thinking it's about data, and I'm watching and I'm like, oh my gosh, baseball is such a good analogy for data because in baseball, any baseball fans out there?
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
Justin, I know you are.
Yeah.
We take so much data in baseball, right? And people do that for fun. There's so many people out there that love taking data on. I do. I like to keep score in baseball. I like to look at the stats. We have RBIs, we have batting average, we have on base percentage, slugging, all of that stuff, right? That's fun data. We like doing that. But for some reason, when we're in school, when we're at work, it's not fun data. But we can make it fun because those baseball batting averages and that baseball data, we use it, right?
Yeah.
Coaches use it to place players in the correct spot. They use it to place players in the correct batting lineup, right? So if we can take our data at school and use it in the same way we use our sports data, imagine the outcomes. So sorry, that's kind of
That's
a
a
really
really
random way to think of it, but I like to think of. I have other analogies too, because when we think of batting average, for example, we don't take data on every single time that baseball player swings a bat. Not every single time. We don't include batting practice. We don't include warm-ups, right? We only include their at-bats. Those at-bats happen in all the games, whether the games are rainy, whether they are sunny and 75 like it was yesterday, no matter the condition. We always take data on those at-bats. And I like to think of like IEP goal trials as at-bats.
Yeah.
But you have to take those at-bats or those trials within the mess too. So like within those rainy baseball games, within those rainy days, also within those days that are perfect conditions. So sorry, I could go on and on forever about data because I love it.
I think that's good. I think it's the idea that it's useful, right? And I think
Yeah.
sometimes that gets lost in the mix. And I know that maybe officially everybody knows that hopefully it's going to be useful and used in a certain way. But I think that analogy of it being baseball, it really does work because it impacts how you do everything moving forward once you have that information. But you have to have the information first.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think part of the reason we utilize trauma-informed FBAs and BIPs is because we're trying to look at that holistic process with kids, and we're trying to look at things beyond just what's happening in the immediate piece of it. And so when we talk about like antecedent behavior consequence data, that's helpful, right? And it can establish trends. Oftentimes it confirms what we already suspected, but it doesn't give you a picture of all the other stuff that leads up to that. So if you think of that behavior, that the target behaviors that we're looking at as those at-bats, that when we're tracking that behavior, that's what that ABC data is looking at. But all these other data pieces, this is going to drive me nuts the whole time. All the other data pieces are telling us all those other circumstances. So they're telling us about all the practices. They're telling us about the background. They're telling us about all of those other pieces of that child's life that have led up to those target behaviors that we're seeing in the moment. And that's why when you're talking about like how the data can be used to tell a child's story, that's why a more comprehensive approach is necessary, and approaching it from a problem-solving perspective is necessary too, because if you approach it with a goal and an outcome in mind, you're going to naturally bias your own data, and you don't want to do that. So looking at it from a problem-solving perspective and looking at it more holistically, like we do with trauma-informed FBAs, helps us be able to get a better picture of the whole child. And I think the other piece of that is that it focuses on those lagging skills, which also gives us more problem-solving things to delve into and problems that we can address and problems we can help kids solve so they can have different behaviors.
Yeah, and I was going to say that I think the data collection becomes difficult for teachers because there's so much emotion tied to it. And so the human aspect of this, you're dealing with a dysregulated nervous system, probably on both ends, a child and yours. And so that becomes taxing a burden because of your capacity at that time, that's where I think it becomes not as fun to collect the data than when you're with other things. And I think when we look at data to collect and we want an outcome, I always tell everybody, if your goal is not to help the child and we're just trying to, if your goal is to a designed outcome, our goal should always be to help the child. Because it doesn't matter what services we qualify them for. At the end of the day, we have to provide a plan to support them because the behaviors don't go away,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's also a misconception. I think that's a culture shift that we've made a lot in our building. It's just, it doesn't matter what their diagnosis is. It doesn't matter where our destination is going to be, because at the end of the day, we have to support and change the child so they're successful. And that's, and whatever those services are to make that happen. So.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a good point. I think that people struggle with data collection, right? I think that it can be hard, and that we are collecting it much like baseball, right? We're collecting it on a bunch of different things. It's not always just one thing that we're collecting it on. Every teacher's collecting data constantly throughout the course of a day, and then you have these extra times where all of a sudden they have to collect more data, maybe on behavior or on something. I mean, it was just or on or in a content area. You might be collecting data. So what are some tips or some advice that you guys might have to simplify data collection? Like, how can we make it a more attainable action?
This is one of my favorite parts of data because you can make it really, really accessible to you. You just kind of have to think outside the box a little bit. One of my favorite ones that is really, really, really simple, but super effective that I used when I was in the classroom was rubber band tracking. So now I'm thinking of all of these trials as at-bats. So I'm going to keep using that.
Yeah, you stick with it.
And look, that
Committed
wasn't on my
to it.
script at all. I totally went off script on the baseball thing. Sorry about that. But I'm sticking with it. So I would take rubber bands and put them on one arm. So maybe like 10 to 12 rubber bands on one arm. And then when I was leading a group lesson, I would take my student who I was observing at that time or taking data on. And then every time they demonstrated the target behavior, or I think for one of them, like it was the student will, say raise their hand to engage instead of shouting out. So every time the student would raise their hand instead of shouting out, I would continue with the lesson, but just move that rubber band from one arm to the other arm. And by the end of the lesson, I would just count the number of rubber bands I had moved. And that way I had a frequency count for every time the child demonstrated the target behavior, the appropriate behavior that we were looking for. That was super easy. I didn't have to think about it. Every time I just moved the rubber band. It was nothing extra, right? Another one is QR codes. That's a really newer one that I've used with some teams. I would post QR codes around the room, and those are linked to a Google form that goes to each child. So, and this is usually for a smaller setting, but it could be used in the gen ed setting as well, based on, different kids. But the QR codes are color coded, and so they know which one goes with which student. So every time you notice a target behavior or whatever you're collecting data on, you just quickly scan that QR code and it brings up the Google form and you just click, 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 done. It takes like 4 seconds.
That's interesting. Have you had people use that very much? Yeah.
Yep. Not very much. It was kind of a newer idea. But yeah, I've had a few, and it's been working really, really well for them.
Yeah, and everybody's carrying their phones around with them. They have them, or it's such an easy thing to do. That's an interesting idea, like how that technology can be kind of incorporated. It's just, I hadn't heard that before.
Well, I think that definitely would work well in a smaller setting, but I think in a larger setting it could work too, because the kids that you're typically collecting target behaviors on, that's not your entire class, right?
Sure.
It's usually 1 or 2 kids. So I think that makes it more manageable too. When we're talking with teams about data collection, a lot of times I think everybody feels the pressure to do all the different pieces of data all at once. And I think that's where it gets really overwhelming. So if you're in the context of an FBA, that's a little bit different, but you have, again, people like us to support you and help guide you with the data collection piece. But if you're just talking about a behavior concern in a classroom and you're like, I just need to get a handle on this, or I'm wondering what I need to do to collect this data, then looking at one aspect at a time. How frequently does this behavior occur? What is the duration of this behavior? Like, how long is it? The frequency is like the rubber bands. The duration might be just jot down 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Getting things accurate to the second isn't the important part of that data collection. It's getting a pattern or a thing that we can compare over time. So I think isolating it to a frequency or a duration or an intensity rating or just one aspect of the behavior when you're at the beginning of problem solving is a really good way to start, because you don't have to look at it all together. For most kids, when we're engaging in that problem solving process, we're looking at environmental factors too. A lot of that can be obtained through interview or through like checklist forms. It doesn't have to be collected throughout the course of a day. So I think it's using different types of data collection together, and then making sure we're isolating things to make it easier for the teams that are collecting. That's going to really give us the most information about that behavior. So, for example, if a kid's doing a behavior 50 times a day, that might be a better one to target than frequency than like a duration. But if a behavior only occurs like twice a week, but it's really intense, then a duration or intensity rating might make more sense. So having, helping teams just target which areas or what type of data to collect, I think makes it less overwhelming.
Yeah. And like not having to think about, I guess the point is there, right, Brianna, that like not every single time that you're going to collect data on anything is it the exact same way that you're doing it, or is it the exact same kind of data that you're collecting. And I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of times we get into a rhythm, I guess, of, well, this is just what we do whenever we have to collect data on some kid, especially behaviorally. You know, there's like one way we do it, or there's one way I did it last year, and so I have to do that. But that may not work, right? And that actually would potentially, if we're doing I hate to say the wrong way, if we're targeting the wrong thing, that actually may put us in a spot where it's taking way more work and way more of our time.
Right.
And it sounds like, I mean, we shouldn't have to spend so much time and effort on this that all of a sudden our normal day-to-day teaching is being interrupted, right? Is that what you guys would say? I mean, I think, and do you guys come across that a lot where teachers love, a lot of teachers are a certain type of personality. We say that a lot. They want to make sure that they're doing something really well, and they're doing it, quote unquote, the right way.
Right.
And it could seem to me that it would become like, I'm so focused on this that all of a sudden it affects how I'm even doing my normal class time, instruction. Do you guys come across that very often, or?
We do.
Well, and I did it as a teacher. I the first few years I had 50 clipboards that I was carrying around and constantly marking everything to where I wasn't, like, in reflection, I was like, I'm not really even teaching. I'm just following everyone around collecting data.
Yeah.
This isn't helpful.
Yeah, that can't be right.
Right.
This couldn't be what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right. And then I had all this data and I'm like, what do I do with this now? Because I'm not teaching them any skills. I'm just following them around, collecting it. So I quickly shifted that, thank goodness, right? To make it more manageable and to collect the right kind of data. Kind of going back to little tips and tricks, we all wear name badges. And I would just put a Post-it on the back of my name badge and had a little pen connected to my lanyard, and would pull that pen off and just mark, tallies or pluses or minuses based on what I was collecting data on. I think that's another key point is to make sure that you're collecting data in small little chunks at different times of the day. So they're natural progressions within your day. A lot of kids, if you're doing behavior data, a lot of kids struggle with transitions. So, put a Post-it outside your classroom door so that when the kids are transitioning, you can tally mark. Nobody has to know what those tally marks mean. You're the only one. You could do a couple different colored Post-its, different color for each kid, whatever. Make it easier within your day. Build it in naturally so that you're not like me in my first few years carrying around 8 clipboards and not really helping anything. Yeah. It doesn't have to be big and fancy to be effective. As long as you know the purpose behind why you're collecting the data, that's the only thing that matters. Yeah. And then what you do with that data is the most important piece.
Yeah. And I was going to share, don't forget the kids can collect data on themselves.
Absolutely.
We forget that a lot. The kids can self-assess or exit slip or self-reflection. Part of our evaluation rubric is for kids to set targeted goals for learning and to self-assess. And that's a great, whether you're a general education teacher or a special education teacher, having kids involved in someone setting those goals and keep monitoring, depending on the age, some of those target behaviors as well. And I was thinking as you guys were talking, I think a lot of times people collect data on the wrong things or it's not measurable. Can you guys share a little bit about the dead man's test that we talk about what kind of data we really should, I think we do a lot of feeling data, which we can't measure. So can you share what we should actually be collecting data on?
So the dead man's test is basically says that if a dead man can do it, then it's not something we should be tracking, right? So we don't want to track non-behavior. We want to track something that is observable and measurable. So if a kid is shouting out during class, that is an observable, measurable behavior. I know what it looks like. If I walked in and I told you you're looking for shouting out during instruction, somebody else could observe that and know, right? Not engaging in a task is not a behavior we would measure because it's passive. If they could, a dead man could sit there and just not do anything, that's not a good behavior to track. We're looking for things that you can observe, that are measurable, that we can communicate to other people. And part of the reason for that is because we often have multiple people collecting data on the same thing with the same kid throughout the course of a school day. So we need consistency in that data collection. We need everybody to be on the same page about what they're looking for and the behaviors that go with it.
Yeah, I think, and that's a good point too. We have all these different players, I guess, all these different teammates that are a part of this, that are trying to collect the data in their own way, or hopefully the same way or a similar way, that they're collecting the same kind of data. How do you actually get a team to see the value of the process, like all of the different parts of the team, and what kind of measurable outcomes? Like, how do you consolidate that? Because you think about a middle school, there might be like third period teachers like, well, I actually think we need to be tracking whether this kid's raising their hand or not. And somebody else might be in first period saying, actually, that's not a problem for me. I want us to track how many times they are up and out of their seat and whatever. How do you kind of consolidate that? How do you get everybody on the same page and get them all bought into a more focused data collection?
So to see the value, quite simply, you just have to use the data that you're asking them to collect. That's the fastest way to lose buy-in.
Yeah.
Is to say, hey, I need you to do all this work. I need you to collect all this data, and then never share the results of why we were collecting the data, never share the analysis of that data. So simply, you have to use the data, and they have to understand why you're asking them to collect the data.
And I think you have to, as part of that, using that data, you have to help them create a plan, an action plan moving forward. So like, it's one thing to do an FBA, and that's great, you get all of this information. But if the FBA sits and everybody just admires the data, then you have not solved any problems. You may have learned a lot of information, but you haven't actually helped yet, right? So we have to translate that FBA and translate that data into an actionable plan that we are going to implement with the kid. And on a day-to-day basis, like when we're talking about behavior plans, for example, there's a lot of components to a behavior plan, and it's our job to help use the data that we've collected and help them understand why, because of this problem, we're doing this part of an intervention. And this intervention or this part of this behavior plan is what's going to help resolve this problem. It's going to treat whatever lagging skill and build a skill set so that they can do what we're asking them to do. But if you don't translate them into that and you just have an FBA sitting, or you say, okay, this is an FBA, we've completed this part of the process, we've checked the box because we're required to do an FBA, then you're losing the entire benefit of the process. And then that people do get frustrated and they will shut down.
Yeah. And I think you asked about administrators and teams.
Yeah.
I think the way you frame why you need the data is really, really important. So, for example, you don't just want to tell a teacher or a para or whoever you're asking to collect the data, I need more data on transitions. Frame it as, we need to track transitions for like 2 weeks. So from there, we can figure out if we need more adult support during that time or if we need to foster more student independence during that time. Frame the why behind why you need that more data. So they're not just out there, collecting tallies for no reason.
Yeah. I think we've all been in spots where, there's some rule or there's something that comes along or there's some whatever, and we've had to track something or collect something, not necessarily even about a student who has some kind of lagging skill or that we're trying to come up with a plan for, but that we've just had to collect stuff. And then we got to the end of the year and we were like, well, I've got like 15 pages. I've got like 48 pages. I have this document that I kept forever. What am I supposed to do with it? And somebody tells us, well, just hang on to it. Yeah. Hang on to it for the next however many years. And you're like, does do we do anything with that? Like, why did I just spend all my time? And so I think having that why behind it and making sure that it gets used, like there's nothing worse than being like, do this just because somebody said to. And then you get to the end of it and you're like, so why did I do that? And they're like, don't worry about it. Like, that's the worst. And that will completely eliminate buy-in really quick moving forward.
Well, I think that when we're talking about using our data, I think sometimes people want to collect anecdotal data, which can be really beneficial, right? And that's why if you're talking about like a trauma-informed process, you're doing a more holistic series of interviews and gathering additional information. And qualitative data like that is still important. We're not saying it's not, but the reason we collect certain types of data is because we need it to be quantitative, because that's what's going to help us in developing a more specific plan. And so I think one of the things that's hard is for teams sometimes to let go of some of that anecdotal data. So like if you're doing ABC data, for example, we really do not need elaboration on what happened, the things that led up to it, what the behaviors look like, because that's the target behavior we're tracking, right? And I think people feel like they have to tell us everything, and then that makes it harder to collect, and then that's more frustrating and challenging for people, right? And so, again, going back to what Ali said, if you are helping teams understand why we're collecting this data, it helps reduce the feeling that they have to give us everything at once, that they can just complete the forms or the data collection piece the way we've asked them to, so that it helps them the most, puts the least burden on them too.
Yeah, I was thinking too, when you meet with a team, one of the first thing is they usually give you their hypothesis of what's going on. I know this kid's doing this because of this, right? So I think an easy data collection buy-in, and I think it was a game changer for me, was like my predictions. Once we collect the data, I was like, oh, he actually did well during that time. It was actually this other area, or the setting location. So there's so many things that for teams to see actually what the real possible behavior issues are that sometimes we misinterpreted because of our own human emotions. That I think that's always neat to have teams come back and then see how the data, it changes that. And to your point too, Brianna, if teams want to tell you all about everything, that's why those interest inventory surveys and staff feedback to have everybody fill out some of those things. Like the lagging skills or the universal needs, the love language things, those are all important to get staff feedback, but in a more data collection based way. So
it takes the guesswork out of everything, right? You're not just using your own ideas, and it takes the bias out of it. We have to close those feedback loops so that we know why we're taking the data and how we're moving forward with helping the student or helping whatever we're taking data on, right? And another thing I want to point out is we often get really, really focused on taking data on the quote bad things, right? The negative type behaviors, how many times someone did something that we don't like or something that's unhelpful to them. Start taking data on some of what can they do well, the positive things. What can they do well? What is working for them? Let's take data on that and then try to generalize that to the other areas where the student's struggling. And that also is helpful for the team with mindset. Excuse me. Helps them kind of shift their mindset into a more positive frame of mind. And I know that, again, from experience, because I was constantly collecting data on
all the things
on all the things they can't do. And it just really, like, with 8 clipboards that I'm running around, not teaching any skills, collecting all the data on the, quote, bad things, that was really heavy. And so that was kind of part of my mindset shift is like, let's collect data on the things that they can do now. Yeah. And that was really helpful.
Yeah. And behavior data doesn't really change because, like classroom academic data, you have to have formative and summative behavior data. So, like, as much as, like, to your point, we should be collecting data that's going to help change what we're doing throughout the week. But then there are also some summative data collection points we could say after so many trials, right? We have to look at it both ways, just like academic data.
And, special education in general, it tends to be deficit-based, right? It tends to be based on identifying problems, identifying things kids can't do. And it's hard to shift that mindset. But I think if you're tracking some of the things that kids can do and trying to kind of infuse the data collection and especially behavior plans with some more strengths-based assessments, which is why we do like resiliency surveys and things. If you use for behavior tracking, you don't only have to track progress on a behavior plan based on a reduction in those target behaviors. You can also track progress in a behavior plan based on an increase of those adaptive behaviors or the pro-social behaviors or whatever the things that we want them to do more of. We can track that too. And that's one thing that we've talked about, trying to get our teams to collect both types of data as part of behavior intervention plans, because that's an important part too, right? We don't just want the behaviors that are getting in their way to be reduced. We also need them to increase skill sets and be able to do more of the things that they want and need to do.
Yeah, how are you maximizing what
Right.
they're able to do, and hopefully because of that, kind of setting them up for success. So, what are as administrators, advocates, coaches, things like that, the people in this room that are
Requiring people
yeah.
to collect the data.
there? Yeah, that's what's happening. Yeah, what are some cautions to people that are out there that are in roles that are like yours about getting teams on board to collect data, or about even collecting data themselves? What are some of those cautions that you would pass on to people?
If you require it, use it.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
That's a
mean,
good one.
don't really know what else to say there. If as an administrator, if you are requiring someone to take data, you have to use it. You again close that feedback loop, close
Yes.
that data cycle, data.
Data.
Yeah.
I think another part of that is making sure that you are giving some type of a platform so that your teams feel heard, whether you're collecting the data that they are wanting that you to collect, or if you're asking for some additional data, you do have to use it, but you also need to have some type of a format or a discussion or an interview that allows them to voice some of their frustrations and concerns. We don't want it to become that's all we do, right? We have to bring it back to the data collection and targeting things more. But if they don't feel heard, then they're going to be more likely to struggle with the data collection process, and they're not necessarily going to see the value in it as much. If you can listen to the concerns and help them understand how this part of data collection is still going to address their concern, you're going to get a lot more buy-in.
Yeah, it's still, I mean, Allie, you mentioned it earlier, I think we're still a people business, right? And that's not just the students and the families that we're serving, but it's also all of the peers that we have around us that we're working alongside, all of those other colleagues. And I think that's super important, is helping people not just feel like it's factory-ish, robotic kind of thing that's being done, but that there's also value in it. And where does that connect? Where do those two sides of the data and also just the human side of it, where do those overlap, and what does that really look like?
Yeah, I would say too, like, you gotta they have people to feel supported. So we're collecting data because there's a problem, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And so, or they need to be celebrated with the good data points, like, feel like they're really accomplishing and doing their job. So you gotta figure out where you're adding support and value, that it wasn't all waste, that I want to see actually productive change, and that you're going to help put those plans in place and execute them that are actually realistic. So I also see a lot of plans at times that are like, well, nobody's going to be able to do all that. Like,
It's too much.
If we have 8 adults working with 1 kid, that would probably be a great idea, but that's not the reality in most settings. So they have to be realistic too.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we run into a lot, and then I'll also give you guys our heads up. We're going to start wrapping this up here in just a second. One of the things we always do at the end is we ask, like, what we want people, if there's like one thing you want people to walk away knowing, what is that? So I'll give you guys a chance to tune me out if you want and start thinking about that. And all 4 of us will answer that question here in a second. But I think a couple of things that we talk about a lot with data collection and just with life in general, right? For teachers, we tend to live in a 2-week cycle, it seems like. That's just, there's no science behind that on my end. It's just something that I've kind of watched over years. People, if they've had a really hard couple weeks, then this year's been really hard. If this student's been really rough this last couple weeks, this student's had a really rough year. If this student's been great the last couple weeks, this student's had a pretty good year. If I've had a really great couple weeks, my class is doing great this year. They're doing really well, right? And that's just part of it. Part of what collecting data does is it eliminates that, or it helps us eliminate that, because we can actually look back not just over the last 2 weeks. We can look back at the end of a year, at the beginning of the year, and say, my gosh, look where we were at the beginning of the year, and now look where we're at now. And I think that's important to not just do your little moment of data collection and then move on and never do anything with it and forget about it. But it's also important to look back at times as an encouragement, hopefully, to you to be like, you know what, look at that. We've come a long way since third grade. We were doing this in a meeting, Josh and I, not too long ago with a student that's now a fifth grader. And we were talking about where they were all the way back when they were a first grader and a second grader, third grader. And we're like, my gosh, look how far. But if you were just in the snapshot of fifth grade, you'd be like, yeah, they've done pretty well. They've done pretty well. And then you look back to like first grade and you're like, my goodness, you couldn't have guessed. You couldn't have guessed this is where we'd be. And then the other thing is that prevalence-induced concept change, which I won't get all the way into it, but just be aware that if you're always looking for something, if you're looking for a problem, which is sometimes what data collection can be, if you're looking for a problem, even after the problem gets solved, you tend to expand your definition of what that problem is. Just be aware that that's a thing that exists. We had a whole episode on it. You can go back and listen to that if you want to, if you're like, I don't know what he just said. That's an important thing, I think, to remember as well as you kind of collect data. And to remember that you're not immune to it yourself. Every one of us gets sucked into that. And so that's important.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't forget about the MTSS process, that when we have solid tier 1 data collection, where and I think this is some work that I think we're all passionate about, is getting, and there's not really somebody like trailblazing this industry right now in tier 1 behavior SEL data collection. So I think we're continuously problem solving. How do we do regular check-ins with our kids? How do we give regular classroom systems some data collection for behavior in there? But if that's your school culture for academics, SEL, and behavior through that MTSS process, then it's not a far jump to go into like a tier 2 intervention where we're maybe collecting a little bit more specific data, or a tier 3 where we're really getting individualized on some of that data collection and progress monitoring. So I think those MTSS systems are critical. That data is our culture in our building, and it does help and support and provide intervention as needed.
Yeah. Allie, you're going to be up next. What do you want people to walk away knowing?
Well, I would love to just go off of what you just said. I would love to trailblaze that tier 1 behavior.
Yeah, right. We have ideas.
That you said something really important, though, is that we focus today on this episode a lot about kind of individual data.
Either one.
But, there's a lot that we could continue talking. We could continue this discussion on classroom data, tier 1 data, building data, district data. I think that is another place that we could really start talking about data and really dive in to then get to this kind of tier 3 data that we
How
just
often
talked
do
about.
we find kids that are having tier 3 behavior data because it's a tier 1 issue?
Absolutely.
And I think
Which is really a district issue or a building issue, right?
Yeah. So anyway, sorry, got us off track again.
Yes.
See, stick to
that
the
was
script,
good.
Allie.
That
Stick
was
to our
good.
script.
No, it's important. That's
Yeah.
really critical. We should do another thing on that.
Sorry. But what I was thinking is just a simple statement that if today's data doesn't change tomorrow's work, why are we collecting it?
Yeah,
that's my
really
final
good.
thought.
Mic drop. There you go.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Because
don't
really,
think I can follow that.
we're not. Why are we collecting it if it doesn't change what we do tomorrow?
Right, that's the point. I mean, at the heart of it is a kid and a problem that we're trying to solve. Whether it's a class-wide problem, a tier 1 problem, a tier 2 problem, an individual problem, a relationship problem, whatever the problem is, at the heart of it is a child and also typically an adult. And so the reason we do all of this data collection, the reason we do all of these different processes and implement these different things is because we are trying to make things better for these humans that are at the middle of this whatever conflict or problem we're trying to solve. And so I think it's easy to get caught up in this very specific pieces of data and to forget the people involved. And I think that's the challenge for teams is to keep the human aspect of it at the center and at the forefront. Because if we do that, everybody's going to feel more supported and we're going to have better results with whatever plans we decide to implement.
Great way to end because that's so true.
Yeah, that's
people.
perfect. Well, thank you guys, Allie and Brianna, for being on. We really appreciate it and appreciate getting to hear from your areas of expertise and things like that. So we always appreciate it. Thank you all for listening and share this with somebody. I think this is an important conversation. I think that it's, again, not always something that is exciting to talk about. It's not always something that is that we're doing a ton of professional development on that people are super like engaged with, but I think that's a mistake because I think it's such a crucial thing. And so hopefully today you either picked up why it's important. Maybe you pass this on to somebody that doesn't find it very important, or that is struggling with it and needs some like quick tips and ideas of how to make it a little easier. Or maybe it's just that you're reminding your team out there that, hey, like this actually shouldn't be something that's such a burden. We should be able to make this easy enough that it doesn't interrupt our day-to-day interactions and our day-to-day job with our students. Whatever it is, I'd encourage you to share it with somebody and keep that conversation going wherever you're at, in your room, in your building, in your district, about data, because it's such an important thing. As always, we'd love for you to be able to share it and give us a review if that's something that you're willing to do. That goes a long way. And let's go out there and do the work.
Let's go do it.